Hi everybody, I'm Jim. This is Great Books, Big Ideas, and it's July 12th, 2026. I think it's time for a reading update because I finished a few books and I want to cover those. I have a couple new pickups that I found at Goodwill to talk about, and I'll just mention some new or active reads that are going on. That's coming right up next on Great Books, Big Ideas. All right, the first book I finished since I last updated you is Regeneration by Pat Barker. This is the first part of a trilogy. It's World War I history from a British perspective, and this was incredible. I really enjoyed this read. I enjoyed it so much that I bought the second and third books in the series, and I started on the second book. I'll talk about that in a second. But this one was an easy read. It focuses on a doctor. His name is Dr. William Rivers, and he's working at this Craig Lockhart War Hospital treating veterans who have shell shock, and they just can't get it together, and they have all these different kinds of symptoms and whatnot. One of the other major characters is the poet Siegfried Sassoon. Wilfred Owen comes up as well. They strike up a friendship. Dr. William Rivers is treating Sassoon, really trying to take this guy who is like protesting the war after he's been wounded and come back from his service, and he's trying to rehabilitate him. And then that comes with some moral complications that are explored in the book as well. Another character who figures very prominently in the plot is Billy Pryor, another war vet who's dealing with some shell shock symptoms, and we follow his ups and downs and his relationships and whatnot. But this was like really, really, really good historical fiction. I understand now why it's so well regarded. And like I said, I just continued on with the next one, The Eye in the Flood. I'm just a little ways into this, but this seems to be picking up more of the story of Billy Pryor and his life. He hasn't come back to serve in the army again yet. He's still back in England, but some interesting new plot twists there to continue on with that story. Well, I'm not sure where that's going to head, but I'm really, really enjoying this Regeneration trilogy by Pat Barker. Highly recommend it. I also finished a book that's not that long, but it took me a little longer to finish it than I expected, and that's The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This was a well-regarded book in its own right. I'm not sure if it won the Booker Prize or not. It might have, but this really is notable for its unreliable narrator. So Mr. Stevens is a butler. He's one of the last great butlers in an era where those types of servicemen are on the wane. He's now got his old lord, the lord of the manor has died. And now he's like working for an American who has bought the place. But it really centers around his repressed, I would call it his repressed love for the housemaid of the manor. And her name is Miss Kenton. And they have an interesting, complicated relationship. It has plenty of conflict on a personal level, but also on a work level. And the crux of this is like the hinge for the plot is Mr. Stevens is encouraged to go on a road trip to the West Country in England to meet Miss Kenton because they have some staff shortages, and he thinks that maybe they've kept up through correspondence. She has married, and he thinks that maybe she would be available to kind of come back and work at the house. That's the excuse. Like the subtext is he really wants to reconnect with her after all these many years. And then there is so much backstory that is filled in along the way as he's taking this little road trip and having little adventures and misadventures along the way. And more of his character is revealed, more and more about the relationship between Mr. Stevens and Miss Kenton, more about the Lord, I think his name is Darlington, that he worked for, who really is a fool like he gets duped by, this is a history of like sort of World War One, between the wars into World War II and beyond. So he's a very highly connected, like, aristocrat in England, but he gets duped by the Nazi diplomats into taking the side of Germany and being one of the appeasers before the war. And there's some anti-Semitism in here that's unsavory. And amid all that, and yet at the same time, the guy's very much a gentleman, and he seems to have good intentions. He doesn't want to see a repetition of what happened in World War I. He thinks the war reparations on Germany were unfair, but he just wants to avoid war. But, he's dealing with Nazis here, and he doesn't really see it. He's accused of being a Nazi sympathizer and all that. And amid all that, as this story kind of is backfilled, Mr. Stevens is ever the gentleman, the dutiful butler who's so loyal to his lord. And you really get exasperated with this narrator. He's the narrator of the story. And this is what's kind of a tour de force about this book, I think, is Ishiguro's management of that narrative voice. It's very consistent. And this is a guy who really doesn't understand himself, or he's repressed it so deeply that it becomes like deeply ironic all the way through. He's all about duty. He's all about loyalty. And that blinds him from the reality that the guy he's working for is essentially a dupe, a fool, or worse. And then Miss Kenton should have been the love of his life, and he let her slip away. And it's painful, it's tragic, it's tragicomic, and it's really a good story. It's really a good story. I was getting exasperated as a reader. I was getting impatient with Mr. Stevens. I wanted to slap him around a little bit, like, you are the fool here. Would you wake up? Well, he comes to a little bit of recognition, I think, at the end of the story as it climaxes. Won't give that away, but it really was a lovely story, and I'm glad I read it. Yeah, and then I also want to talk about a couple films I watched, film adaptations of books, one of which was The Remains of the Day. So we found that on, I forget which station or which streaming channel that has it, but I found that. We watched it. Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson, who are just terrific. Christopher Reeves is in it. He's the American, and it's a great cast. Great costume, historical drama, and a by and large very successful film. I think it was up for Academy Awards. I don't know which ones it won. This was back in the 90s, but I never had seen it. I heard of it, but I never seen it. I'm glad I finally got around to watching it. It was Anthony Hopkins is like the perfect casting for this character. And he does so much with his facial expressions and his demeanor to just convey what this narrator conveys through words. And my only quibble with it, and I can't talk about this in too much detail, but I was puzzled by the end of the film. It does have a very similar climax where he finally, meets with Miss Kenton and all that. And he realizes that this isn't going to happen. And she's going to go back to her husband. She has a little bit of a difficult marriage, but she has some reasons for going back. And it's just not going to come together. And then there's a real big kind of enagnoresis type of self-realization moment that I thought was much better portrayed in the book than it was in the film. And I was a bit mystified why the film didn't even try to play out that particular scene in the aftermath of his final meeting with Miss Kenton. It's so dramatic that it just seems to be tailor-made for a film scene, and it didn't happen. They substituted. They kind of left you to draw your own conclusions, and then they tack on this one little scene where he's back at the mansion talking with Christopher Reeves, the American guy. And there's this little scene with a pigeon that comes down the chute and through the fireplace, and they kind of release it out the window, and it's very feels kind of rushed. And I get what they were going for with that little scene, but I think it was a wasted opportunity to really seal the deal like they did here in the book. You're waiting for that scene here, and this book really delivered it. The film did it in a way more subtly than this one did. But that being said, it's a good film adaptation, and I am a big critic of film adaptations. I very rarely find the film to be better than the book. I almost would say the film was better than the book up until that last part, but you do miss the narrative voice that you get in the book. You don't quite get that in the film, but you do get Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson, who they're just terrific. But that's The Remains of the Day. The third book I finished, and this was one I just pulled off the shelf. It called out to me. I've been meaning to read it for a long time. And it's The Johnstown Flood by David G. McCullough, a young David McCullough. This came out, I think, in the late 60s, around 1970. This is history of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and that massive flood in, I think it was in 1889, May 31st, 1889. A dam broke miles away from Johnstown, up in the mountain, and it was a dam that was an earthworks dam that was for the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club, which was a rich man's retreat. And by rich, we're talking ultra rich, as in all the Pittsburgh industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick, the Mellons, that level. And they knew the dam was weak. They didn't do enough to fix it. And then they had this biblical amount of rain that just overwhelmed everything. The dam broke and flooded out that whole valley. All that water went down into Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which was a steel mill town. And a couple thousand people died. It was horrific, a literal wall of water. Well, I'm not going to say too much about this book now, because I really do want to devote a video just to this book, which I thought was awesome. It was very well done history. And I'm personally very interested in this because my father was from Johnstown. His grandfather, my great-grandfather, was working for the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time of the flood. He was he worked for a wrecking crew, and that after the flood, they came in to start clearing things out. And according to another historical source, I'm pretty sure this checks out because the man's name and his initials match my great-grandfather's. He rescued about 15 or 16 people out of the Conemaugh River when the flood happened. So he was very involved in that. And also, he met my great-grandmother, Mary Haggerty, who was Irish, met her during the flood relief efforts, and they got married, I think, in December 1889. So my family is very personally invested in the Johnstown flood. I don't think we lost anyone in the flood exactly, but there is that very strong tie-in. And it's part of the whole mythic history of Johnstown. It's not the only flood they've ever had, but this was by far the worst one. And this was my parents' copy. I remember they bought this when it came out. They were very excited to read it. And I finally got around to reading it, and I really enjoyed it. But I want to spend a little more time on it, I think. Stay tuned for another video on this. I'll try to do a short review, show you some pictures from it, and flesh out the story from there. But boy, what a great history this is. I recommend it if you're into that kind of thing. And what else? Then I also read a Lawrence Durrell book called Tunk. This is the hardcover edition, might be a first edition. This is the first in a double-decker novel called The Revolt of Aphrodite. But it was issued as two separate books at first. Tunk was the first one, and then Nunquam was the second one. I actually read a paperback edition of Nunquam before I read the first book, and this was many years ago, probably 12, 15 years ago. And I don't think I really realized initially that it was the second of a two-parter. So things didn't always make a whole lot of sense. But now I read them in the proper order. So after I finished Tunk, I went to this combined edition of Tunk and Nunquam, which he then called The Revolt of Aphrodite. And I read the second part, Nunquam, in this edition that I got from Faber, I don't know, maybe about 5 years ago. And so I read the books back to back. What is Tunk about? And Nunquam, well, it's about this guy, Felix, who is a scientist and an inventor, and he comes up with this sort of vaguely described tape recording device, artificial intelligence box that he calls Able. And I wish Durrell had described it a little bit more explicitly, because it was pretty fuzzy. Like at times it just sounds like a tape recorder, but it's much more than that. But he's an inventor. You think from the thing, and then this attracts the interest of this sort of shady, transnational, multinational, secret corporation type of entity called the Firm, and that's run by two brothers, Julian and Jokas. Jokas lives in Turkey. Julian's more westernized, and he kind of roams all over the place, England and other places. And so what they do is they recruit Felix to work for the Firm. That's the heart of the story. But it's very much also about the friendships and the love relationships of Felix with primarily two women. Io is her nickname, which reminds me of the character from Ovid. But her name is Iolanthe. She is initially in the story, she's like a prostitute in Athens, but she's kind of the girlfriend of Felix. They have a brief relationship. And then later in the book, she becomes a movie star, transforms her identity. And then the woman that he eventually marries is Benedicta, who is related to the guys in the Firm. And she's a very mysterious, mercurial, kind of unpredictable character. And he's very taken with her. So they have a romance. They eventually marry. They eventually have a child. They eventually lose that child in a way that I will not describe because I don't want to spoil it. And then as you get towards the end of Tunk, you start to see, basically they put Felix on retainer, and he's like fabulously wealthy because this firm has its fingers in every pie that you can imagine, whether it's industry or commerce or pharmaceuticals or agriculture or any kind of trading, finance. Like they have tentacles everywhere, and they can afford to just put him on retainer, and his job is just to invent and engineer things. And he has a crew that he works with. The setting kind of shifts from Athens to Turkey, and then from Turkey to London, and he sets up shop in London, and he's doing all these different projects and whatnot. Well, he's also, the longer he goes along, he kind of starts to feel like he's lost his freedom. So be careful what you wish for when it comes to these kind of things. It's like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave the Firm, right? So you can't really check out for the Firm, or you think you can check out, but they're still lurking around. So he's sort of haunted by that. He doesn't quite understand. He's not really sure who he's working for or what they're all about. He never actually sees Julian until much, much later in volume 2. And but then basically what happens, what this is all leading to, is Iolanthe, the first girlfriend who became a movie star, she passes away. But then Julian, one of the heads of the Firm, he really runs the thing. He wants to make a humanoid robot version of her. And then it's Felix's job to get that done. And that's when it gets really interesting. I would say I preferred volume 2, Nunquam, more than volume 1, which had good moments in it, but there was a lot of moments of fuzziness and confusion. But you really need to read volume 1 before you get to volume 2 in here, the Nunquam volume. But the volume 2 is where it really kicks into gear and the plot starts moving along. And a shorter book too. But now that you know the characters, the ensemble, all that, like it's kind of like hurtling towards a conclusion. But so long story short, they build this robot. It's like extremely lifelike, has artificial intelligence. They call it a dummy, but she's like so real, and it freaks everyone out. And then they test her, then they kind of launch her, or she launches herself into the public space in very unpredictable ways at the end of the novel, which I won't give away. But it's a sort of a reflection. It's a little bit of a Frankenstein story, Frankenstein's monster. There's that element, definitely echoes of Faust, the Faustian bargain. This theme of like freedom, independence is definitely applicable both to Felix's situation and to Iolanthe, the robot. There's a lot going on here that kind of weaves in and out. But it's also a page turner, especially the second volume, where you want to see how it all ends. I really like reading Durrell's prose. I know he's out of fashion, everything. This probably is not as good as the Alexandria Quartet or even the Avignon Quintet. I would probably rate it a little lower. But in terms of a lot of the ideas in here and this kind of pseudo-science fiction aspect to the book, I think it's a little bit predictive of where we're at now currently with the status of artificial intelligence and humanoid robots. You go out on YouTube, you run some searches for these things, you're going to be pretty disturbed about what you find. This was written in the 1960s, so it took a few decades for things to come to the point where we're nearing what he was describing in this book. But he also said about this novel that it's about culture, which I would have to reread it to kind of see that more, but I half understand what he was driving at with this. But that was my Lawrence Durrell for the summer. I might read another Durrell book, like I might read one of his travel books later in the summer, we'll see. But that was like, I'm glad, I didn't expect to have to read Nunquam, but when I finished Tunk, it was just really ended in the middle of things, and I'm like, well, I got to see how it ends. I forget that first read. It's been so many years. And and then you pick up. You actually start Nunquam where Felix has had like a mental breakdown too. So he's basically like a loony, and he gets out of the loony bin. He reacquaints with Benedicta, and then they kind of pick up from there. He starts working for the firm again. But it's about life. It's about death. It's about freedom. It's about this Faustian bargain, what we make with technology and science, and that the impact of culture and all that. So it's, I think for certain readers, it's a worthwhile read. But it wouldn't be my starting point for Lawrence Durrell. But if you want to go deeper into his work, it's certainly worthy of that. I want to mention one other film adaptation that we watched, and I remember seeing a video by Philip Hall. I think he's calling himself Dr. Phil Reads now. He's an Australian poet. I love his channel. He's great. And I think he had like a Folio Society edition of Hamnet, the novel, which also got adapted into a film. And I haven't read the book yet. I don't have the book, but we did watch the film, and it was really, really good. It was really good, really good. Very dramatic. I think that was up for some best picture, best actor types of nominations. And I think the actress won the Best Actress Oscar for it, and she really was good. And the guy who played Shakespeare was really, really good. But it's basically a family drama about Anne Hathaway, who's named Agnes in the film. So apparently, like, some sources refer to her as Agnes, not Anne. I don't know what's up with that. But Anne Hathaway, wife of Shakespeare, and their family and their kids. Susanna, I think the older daughter's name was, and then Judith and Hamnet were twins. And poor Hamnet dies at the age of 11 from the plague. And these are facts that we know from Shakespeare's biography. And this was right around the time when Shakespeare also lost his own father, who was a glover in Stratford-upon-Avon. And it's also around the time when he wrote some of his great tragedies, especially Hamlet, which is basically a name that's interchangeable with Hamnet. You know, the Elizabethans had lots of spellings for the same word. And this looks at the relationship of Shakespeare. The guy who played Shakespeare was really good. And Agnes, how they fall in love. She gets pregnant. They have to marry. They raise the family, and then it's a good film about like the tortured artist and like he feels pretty confined in Stratford. He loves his wife, he loves his kids, but he's got to get to London to pursue his writing and his acting and theater career where they have more opportunities. So he has this sort of back and forth life where a lot of the time he's not at home and she's a single parent, she has to raise a family, and then he'll come back when it's off season or there's a plague in London and he can't, you know, they shut the theaters. So he comes back, and that of course creates problems in their marriage, but they love one another, they stick together, they tough it out. But then there's this tremendous tragic loss with the kid Hamnet, who's so cute in the film. They just, you know, first Judith gets sick with the plague and they think she's going to die, and then she actually survives, and Hamlet's the one who dies. And Shakespeare is just, you know, very distraught over this. And then he goes back to London and writes Hamlet. And then the film ends with finally Agnes comes to London with her brother, who's another good character in the movie, and he's supportive. And they kind of see where Shakespeare has been living in this like small little garret, you know, in London, this kind of a one-room apartment, and where he does his writing, but then they see the play Hamlet performed at the Globe Theatre, and this was very moving because it's where art and life come together, and you see how art transforms the suffering of life. The loss of a child has to be one of the worst, most tragic losses a person could experience. And I really didn't have a dry eye for most of this film. It was like kind of geared to sort of open up the floodgates, and it certainly did that, especially at the end. I was, you know, basically weeping in that kind of climax where she's watching Hamlet be performed, like Hamlet's death scene. It was so well directed too. It was very, very well done. So yeah, it's definitely a tearjerker, but sometimes that's very cathartic to let those emotions out. So those are the books that I finished, and a couple film adaptations that I watched. Both were successful film adaptations, but a couple of the new reads I'm working on. Well, I told you about The Eye and the Door, the next Pat Barker in the trilogy. I also started The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. I don't know why, it just sort of called to me off the shelf. I started reading it, and I really like it so far. I've made good headway in that. I started reading the French Decadence Reader, which is French Decadent Tales, but it's a reader, it's an anthology of late 19th, early 20th century decadent writing, short stories. And I read a couple stories in that. So I think I'll continue on. I'm back to reading Lewis Mumford, The Pentagon of Power, which is a book that's been around here for over 2 years. I dip in and out of it. It's so good. I don't know why I don't just read the whole thing, but I just take it in very small doses. But every time I come back to it, I like what I'm reading. And I'm a big Lewis Mumford fan. Like it mystifies me why more people don't talk about him these days. Other stuff that's going on too, but that's some of the highlights. What have you all been reading? Now it's your turn. Tell me what books you finished. What have you started? Did you get anything new? I will mention my 2 new pickups. I promised you that. I almost forgot. Well, here's the cool thing. We live here in Westchester, Southeast Pennsylvania, Philly region. I discovered, thanks to a neighbor, she told me, I had no idea, we have a new Goodwill store that's really close to town here. That's now become the closest Goodwill. It's only like 10 minutes away or less. I was thrilled. Now we have a Goodwill that we can check with more regularity. And so, I looked it up. I didn't even know where it was. And usually I'm up on these things. I might find out about it through Facebook or something. But I think this has been open since April. And this is literally the first I've heard about it. So I've told my wife, like, let's go. We got to check this store out. I know where it is. They're open. And she's always up for a thrift store. So she's like, all right, let's go. So we kind of jumped in the car and rode over there and gave it a look. Well, I found 2 books at Goodwill. Each of these were $3. The first was part 2 of Either Or by Soren Kierkegaard. This is a Princeton University Press edition. I think they basically issued everything Kierkegaard wrote. And this is philosophy, heavy-duty Christian existentialist philosophy. I have read Either Or, but I got this because it has notes in it. It's a different translation. And I just couldn't pass it up. Like, how often do you see like scholarly editions of Kierkegaard in the Goodwill store for $3? So yeah, I got that. And I was also very happy to find this Oxford World's Classics edition of Wordsworth and Coleridge Lyrical Ballads. This includes 2 editions of the book. The first edition of 1798 and the expanded 1802 edition, where they add a lot more poems and they change the sequence, and Wordsworth adds his famous preface to the Lyrical Ballads. This looks like a really nice edition. It was edited by Fiona Stafford with an introduction and notes. And it is pretty heavily marked up, but for $3.99, I was really happy to get this. This is arguably the most famous book of poetry in English literary history. This is where British Romanticism starts. This really is, boom, the moment when it kind of, you turn the ignition and off the car goes. And I'm really excited to read the Lyrical Ballads like in their sort of original version. And then you can see, like, imagine this is like kind of a music artist. You've got like the OG first edition, and then you have like the remixed, remastered, appended box set edition of 1802 with a whole bunch of more extras on it, plus the liner notes, the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Like, how amazing to get this all in one package with notes and an introduction. So, yeah, I mean, I have my big edition of Wordsworth's poetry, which I'm very, very, very slowly working my way through. But this is nice to just focus on Lyrical Ballads in 2 instances of it. So you can kind of put yourself in the shoes of a reader who is encountering this groundbreaking poetry for the first time. And yeah, I'll probably talk more about this in a separate video too. We'll see how that goes. That is my update. Thank you for sticking with me as I ramble, as usual. It's good to see everybody again. I hope you'll come back soon, and be well. Peace out. Leave a comment or question. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.